What if the Anunnaki didn't create humanity but found us already here? What if the being Sumerian tablets described descending from heaven arrived not into an empty world, but into one already inhabited, already noisy, already teeming with the chaos of human life? The ancient texts speak of humanity's noise disturbing the gods, of populations that had multiplied beyond control, of labourers who existed before the creation narrative begins. But if humans were created to serve, who built the first fires? Who planted the first seeds? Who carved the paths between rivers before kingship ever descended from the sky? Beneath the sands of southern Iraq, clay tablets still preserve a memory older than the gods who claim to have made us. Each wedge pressed into wet earth carries the weight of contradiction, stories that assume human presence before the story of human origin. So before the silence deepens, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories. That question, who was first? And if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I'd like to imagine this question stretching across the world, connecting sleepless minds in the dark. In the British Museum, catalogue number 78941 sits behind climate-controlled glass, a clay tablet no larger than a modern paperback, its surface covered in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet earth nearly 4,000 years ago. The tablet contains one of the most complete versions of the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian narrative composed around 1800 BC, but preserving oral traditions that stretch back centuries earlier into the murk of unrecorded time. When scholars first translated this text in the mid-20th century, they classified it as a creation myth, a theological poem explaining how and why humanity came to exist. But read carefully, read with attention to what the text actually says rather than what we expect it to say, the Atrahasis reveals something far stranger than mythology. It reads like an administrative record of a crisis, a bureaucratic account of a management failure, and embedded within its careful cuneiform lines is a contradiction so fundamental that it destabilizes everything we assume about human origins. The narrative opens not with divine majesty or cosmic creation, but with labour dispute. Before humans existed, the text explains, the gods themselves performed the work necessary to maintain civilization. They dug canals, dredged rivers, maintained irrigation systems. For 40 years, the Igigi, the younger gods, laboured under the command of the senior gods, the Anunnaki. The work was exhausting, endless, and finally unbearable. The Igigi rebelled, burning their tools, surrounding the house of Enlil, refusing to continue. The solution proposed by the Divine Council was humanity. Let man assume the drudgery of God, the text declares. Humans were designed, bred, and deployed to take over the labour the divine order could no longer sustain internally. This is typically read as a creation narrative, the origin of our species explained through divine necessity. But the text continues, and what follows creates a problem that scholars have largely chosen not to address directly. 1,200 years pass after humanity's creation, the population grows, and then the gods face a new crisis, one described with a phrase that should trouble anyone who reads it carefully. The land became wide, the people became numerous, the land bellowed like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, "The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket." The word the text uses is rigmu, an Akkadian term that translates as noise, clamour, uproar. Modern translations sometimes soften it to disturbance or commotion, but the original carries something harsher, the unbearable den of chaos, the sound of something grown beyond control. Enlil's complaint is not moral or spiritual, it is practical, managerial, the frustration of an administrator facing a system that has exceeded its designed parameters. But here is the question the text forces us to confront. How did humanity become numerous enough to generate unbearable noise so quickly after being created? The Atrahasis gives a timeline, 1,200 years from creation to population crisis. Even with aggressive reproduction, even with ideal conditions, the mathematics of population growth cannot produce a civilization so vast and clamorous in so short a time. 1,200 years is roughly 60 generations. Starting from a small created population, even doubling every generation, you cannot arrive at the kind of density that disturbs cosmic order. The numbers do not work unless the narrative assumes something it does not state directly, that humans already existed in significant numbers before the creation story begins. Read the text again with this possibility in mind. The gods create humans to perform labour. But what labour? The Atrahasis describes the Agigi digging canals, managing rivers, maintaining agricultural systems. These are not divine tasks. Gods do not need irrigation to feed themselves. Gods do not require grain stores or flood control or organised agricultural production. The labour described is labour that benefits mortal populations, labour that assumes someone already exists to eat the crops, drink the water, live in the cities that require this infrastructure. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis is not the creation of life from nothing. It is the creation of a workforce to manage systems that already existed for beneficiaries the text does not name. Consider what the text actually describes. Before the Agigi rebellion, there was infrastructure. Canals existed, agricultural systems operated, cities required maintenance. The divine labour that exhausted the younger gods was not abstract cosmic work. It was the practical, physical work of civilization, work that makes sense only if civilization already existed, if populations already depended on these systems for survival. The Atrahasis does not describe the origin of humanity. It describes the origin of a particular relationship between humanity and divine authority, the moment when humans became the designated labourers of a pre-existing system. Who was the system built for originally? The text cannot answer because the text was written after the transition, by scribes who inherited a framework they did not create and perhaps did not fully understand. But the logic remains embedded in the narrative, waiting for someone to notice the contradiction. The creation of humans to replace divine labourers assumes the labour was already necessary, and labour is only necessary if someone needs its products. The silence in the text is not empty. It is full of presence the narrative cannot acknowledge, the presence of those who needed the canals before humans were made to dig them. This becomes even more troubling when we examine how the Atrahasis describes the crisis that followed. The noise that disturbed Enlil was not the noise of a small created population slowly expanding. It was the noise of a civilization already teeming, already chaotic, already beyond the capacity of divine governance to manage. The land bellowed like wild oxen. This is not the sound of 60 generations of careful growth. This is the sound of a population that was already vast, already complex, already generating the din of urban life, agricultural labour, human existence at scale. The divine response confirms this interpretation. Enlil does not attempt education or guidance. He does not try to organise the humans he supposedly just created. He immediately moves to population control measures, plague, famine, environmental restriction, and finally the flood. These are not the responses of a creator managing a new project. These are the responses of an administrator, trying to reduce a pre-existing population that has grown beyond acceptable limits. The Atrahasis preserves something its authors may not have fully understood, a memory of contact rather than creation, of divine authority encountering a human world that already existed and attempting to manage what it could not control. A creation narrative is not the beginning of the story. It is the moment when divine governance was imposed on a species that predated its arrival. Everything that follows in the text, the noise, the crisis, the failed interventions, the flood, makes sense only if humanity was already here, already numerous, already generating the clamour of existence before the gods claimed to have made us. In the 1940s, Iraqi archaeologists working at the ancient city of Eridu made a discovery that official reports described in careful, understated language. Beneath the earliest temple foundations, beneath the mud brick platforms that scholars dated to the beginning of Sumerian civilization around 5400 BC, the excavation teams found evidence of earlier occupation, and beneath that they found irrigation channels. The channels were not crude or experimental. They were engineered with the same principles that would govern Mesopotamian water management for the next 5,000 years, angled to control flow, sized to serve agricultural plots, positioned to draw from the Euphrates distributaries that once coursed through the region. The dating was difficult to determine precisely, but the stratigraphic evidence was clear. The channels predated the temples. Water management existed before the religious institutions that would later claim divine authority over the land. This creates a problem for the standard narrative of Mesopotamian civilization. The conventional story describes Sumerian culture emerging around 4000 BC, developing writing around 3400 BC, and building the first true cities over the following millennium. The temples were supposed to be the organizing institutions, the centres from which irrigation, agriculture and urban life radiated outward. The priesthoods administered the land because the gods had given it to them. But the irrigation channels at Eridu tell a different story. Water management came first. Someone was controlling the rivers, directing the floods, enabling agriculture before the temple complexes rose on their platforms. The infrastructure preceded the institutions that claimed credit for creating it. The Atrahasis epic describes the Igigi performing exactly this kind of labour: canal digging, river management, the endless work of maintaining irrigation in a landscape shaped by seasonal floods. But the Igigi were divine beings, younger gods who served the Anunnaki before humans were created to replace them. If we read this literally, divine entities performed the hydraulic engineering that enabled Mesopotamian civilization. If we read it as mythology, the story is explaining the origins of irrigation through divine metaphor. But what if we read it archaeologically? What if the Igigi represent a memory of whoever actually built those early channels, whoever managed the water before the Sumerians rose to prominence, whoever created the infrastructure that later populations would inherit and expand? The Atrahasis was composed around 1800 BC, but it draws on traditions far older. By the time Babylonian scribes pressed these words into clay, the events described were already ancient history, already legendary, already filtered through centuries of retelling. The text does not describe what the scribes witnessed. It describes what they inherited, stories passed down from a time before their culture existed in its recognizable form. And what those stories describe, stripped of theological elaboration, is labor, physical labor, the kind of work that builds and maintains civilization. Canal digging, river dredging, flood control, agricultural management. These are not abstract divine activities. These are human-scale tasks, requiring human-scale effort, producing human-scale results. The Igigi laboured for 40 years, the text tells us, until their exhaustion became unbearable. 40 years of digging canals, managing water, maintaining systems. This is not cosmic mythology. This is a work schedule. It is the memory of a labour force that predated the formal structures of Mesopotamian civilization, a workforce whose efforts created the infrastructure that later cultures would build upon. And here is the question that emerges from the mud of Eridu's excavations. If the irrigation channels predated the temples, who dug them? If water management existed before formal religious institutions claimed authority over the land, who managed the water? The conventional answer is that early Sumerian communities developed these technologies gradually, through trial and error, across centuries of experimentation. But the archaeological evidence does not support gradual development. The earliest irrigation systems at Eridu and other sites appear already sophisticated, already engineered according to principles that would remain constant for millennia. There is no visible experimental phase, no record of failed attempts, no stratigraphic evidence of learning. The technology appears already mature. This pattern repeats across Mesopotamian archaeology. Writing appears already systematic. Mathematics appears already complex. Astronomy appears already precise. Agriculture appears already organized. Every foundational technology of Sumerian civilization emerges without visible developmental stages, as though these skills were not invented but inherited, passed down from sources the archaeological record cannot identify. The Atrahasis offers an explanation the scribes who copied it may not have fully understood. The labour came first, the infrastructure came first, divine beings, the Igigi, performed the work before humans were created to continue it. But divine beings do not need irrigation. They do not require food production. They do not benefit from agricultural surplus. The labour the text describes makes sense only if mortal beneficiaries already existed, populations who needed the water, the crops, the organised landscape that the Igigi supposedly created. The creation of humanity was not the beginning of civilization. It was the transfer of an existing project to new management. The humans who emerged to assume the drudgery of God inherited systems already in operation, infrastructure already functioning, a world already organised for habitation. They were not the first occupants, they were the replacement workforce. And whoever the work was originally performed for, whoever benefited from the Igigi's 40 years of canal digging before humans existed to continue the labour, remains unnamed in the texts we have, present only as implication, as logical necessity, as the silent answer to a question the scribes never thought to ask. In the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalogue number CBS 10673 holds a fragment of clay that has puzzled scholars for over a century. The tablet contains a portion of the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest Sumerian creation narratives, dated to approximately 1600 BC, but preserving traditions that reach back to the 3rd millennium and beyond. The text is damaged, portions missing, but what survives is enough to create a profound difficulty for anyone attempting to read it as a coherent origin story. The Eridu Genesis names 5 cities that existed before the flood, before the narrative of human creation reaches completion: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Lutu Shurapak. These are not mythological locations invented to populate a cosmic drama. They are real places, cities that appear in the archaeological record, sites that have been excavated and dated and mapped. Eridu alone shows continuous occupation from before 5000 BC, layers of temples built and rebuilt, across millennia, each foundation carefully aligned with the one beneath. The text describes these cities existing in the Anti-diluvian age, governed by the Anunnaki, holding the sacred offices of civilization before the flood swept over and reset the world. But here is the problem the scribes never address. If humans were created as the texts describe, fashioned from clay and divine blood to replace the labouring Igigi, who built these cities, who named them, who established the sacred offices and governing structures that the Anti-diluvian kings administered for tens of thousands of years, the Sumerian king list, that strange administrative document that records reigns of impossible length, lists rulers who governed these 5 cities before the flood. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years, Alalga for 36,000. The numbers are obviously not literal human lifespans, but they suggest the scribes believed something substantial and continuous existed in these places for vast stretches of time. Yet the creation narratives describe humanity as a recent innovation, a solution to a labour crisis, a replacement workforce deployed to maintain systems the gods could no longer sustain. The timeline contradicts itself. The cities predate the creation of humans. The cities were governed by divine beings in the Anti-diluvian age. But cities are human-scale constructions, requiring human-scale populations, serving human needs for shelter, organisation, communal life. Divine beings do not need cities. The Anunnaki, as described in the text, dwell in temples, in cosmic locations, in the heavens from which kingship descended. They do not require urban infrastructure. They do not benefit from streets and walls and neighbourhoods and marketplaces. The 5 antediluvian cities make sense only if humans already existed to inhabit them. Eridu's archaeology confirms this reading in ways the texts cannot. The excavations reveal not a city founded by divine decree, but a settlement that grew organically layer upon layer, from small shrines to massive temple platforms, from scattered huts to organised urban grids. The earliest levels show human habitation stretching back before 5000 BC, before any reasonable date for the events the creation narratives describe. Humans were living at Eridu, building at Eridu, dying and being buried at Eridu for millennia before the Sumerian civilization that would later record its mythology. The Eridu Genesis names the city as the first seat of kingship, the place where divine authority first touched the earth. But the archaeological record names it as something else, one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in Mesopotamia, a place where humans lived generation after generation across thousands of years, where temples rose and fell and rose again on the same sacred ground. The divine narrative and the human evidence do not align. They describe the same place but different stories: divine foundation versus organic settlement, cosmic, decree versus accumulated occupation, creation versus presence, and the presence predates the creation story by millennia. What the texts preserve is not the origin of these cities, but the origin of a particular claim to these cities, the moment when divine authority asserted governance over places that already existed, populations that already thrived, traditions that already accumulated across centuries of human habitation. The creation of humanity is not the founding of civilization. It is the incorporation of an existing civilization into a new theological and administrative framework. The cities were not built by the gods. They were claimed by the gods. And whoever built them, whoever named them, whoever lived in them before kingship descended from heaven, remains invisible in the official record, present only as implication, as archaeological stratigraphy, as the contradiction the scribes recorded but never resolved. In 1948, a team of archaeologists working in the foothills of Iraqi Kurdistan at the site called Jarmo uncovered something that would quietly revolutionize our understanding of human prehistory. The site itself was unremarkable at first glance, a series of collapsed mud brick structures on a hillside overlooking the fertile valleys that drain toward the Tigris. But among the artifacts recovered from the earliest occupation levels, dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 7000 BC, were tools made from a material that could not have originated within hundreds of miles of the site. Obsidian, volcanic glass, black and sharp and beautiful, capable of holding an edge finer than surgical steel. The nearest obsidian sources to Jarmo lie in eastern Anatolia, in the volcanic highlands around Lake Van and the mountains near modern Erzurum. The distance is not vast by modern standards, perhaps 300 miles as the crow flies, but for prehistoric populations supposedly living at the edge of organised existence, supposedly scattered in small bands, with limited social complexity, supposedly lacking the cognitive and organisational capacity for coordinated action, that distance represents something extraordinary. Someone at Jarmo 9,000 years ago possessed obsidian that came from Anatolia. This was not a chance encounter, a wandering hunter stumbling upon volcanic glass and carrying it home. The quantities found at Jarmo and similar sites indicate sustained trade, repeated contact networks of exchange that stretched across mountain ranges and river systems and hundreds of miles of intervening territory. By the 1960s, archaeological chemistry had advanced to the point where obsidian could be traced to its specific volcanic source through analysis of trace elements. Each obsidian flow has a unique chemical signature, a fingerprint that allows archaeologists to match artifacts to their origin points with remarkable precision. When researchers began applying these techniques to the obsidian scattered across Near Eastern archaeological sites, the results were staggering. Trade networks emerged from the data like invisible highways suddenly illuminated. Obsidian from Nemrut Dagh reached sites throughout Mesopotamia and the Levant. Obsidian from Bengal travelled west and south and east. By 10,000 BC, before the first permanent settlements in Mesopotamia, before agriculture stabilised enough to support villages, before any of the developments that supposedly mark the birth of civilization, humans were moving obsidian across vast distances with enough consistency and volume to leave a clear archaeological signature. These were not random movements. The patterns show directionality, show regular routes, show the kind of sustained contact that requires language, coordination, shared understanding, social structures capable of maintaining relationships across space and time. The people cannot trade unless they can communicate. They cannot establish regular exchange unless they can make and keep agreements. They cannot maintain trade routes across generations unless they can transmit knowledge, preserve relationships, organise themselves into entities more complex than isolated family bands. The Obsidian Trails prove that human society in the Near East was far more sophisticated by 10,000 BC than any simple model of gradual development would suggest. And obsidian was only one commodity in a network that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Shell beads from the Gulf appear in inland sites. Shells from the Red Sea travelled north. Bitumen from natural seeps in Mesopotamia moved in multiple directions. Greenstone, carnelian, native copper, all left traces of movement across the archaeological record, all indicating networks of exchange that operated for millennia before anything conventionally called civilization appeared in the region. When scholars discuss the rise of Sumerian civilization, they typically begin around 4000 BC with the Uruk period, the explosive growth of the first true cities, the invention of writing, the emergence of the temples and palaces and social hierarchies that would define Mesopotamian culture for the next 3,000 years. This framing creates the impression that civilization appeared relatively suddenly, emerging from simpler antecedents across a few centuries of rapid development. But the obsidian evidence demolishes this impression. Human populations in the region were already organising, already trading, already maintaining complex social relationships for at least 6,000 years before the first Sumerian city. The sudden appearance is an illusion created by the visibility of certain kinds of evidence, the monumental architecture and written records that archaeologists can easily recognise. The slower, subtler developments that preceded this visibility stretched across millennia, building the cognitive and social foundations that would eventually erupt into urban civilization. And this leads to Göbekli Tepe, the site that has forced archaeologists to fundamentally reconsider what prehistoric humans were capable of achieving. In southeastern Turkey, on a rounded hilltop overlooking the Harran Plain, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations in 1994 that would reveal something that should not exist according to conventional models of human development. Stone circles, massive T-shaped pillars carved from limestone, some weighing more than 15 tons, arranged in concentric rings around central pairs of even larger pillars. Animal carvings of extraordinary sophistication, lions and bulls and foxes and birds and snakes rendered with artistic skill that would not seem out of place in any later period of human history. And beneath the first circles, earlier circles, and beneath those still earlier constructions, layer after layer of monumental building stretching back to at least 9600 BC, the very end of the last ice age, 6,000 years before the first Sumerian temple at Eridu. The implications of Göbekli Tepe are still being absorbed by the scholarly community, but the essential fact is clear. Humans were capable of organised, monumental, sophisticated construction at a date when they were supposedly still wandering in small bands, supposedly lacking the cognitive complexity for coordinated action, supposedly millennia away from the social organisation required to build anything permanent. The site shows no evidence of permanent habitation, no houses, no domestic structures, no signs of daily life. This was not a settlement. It was a gathering place, a ceremonial centre, a location where people came together from the surrounding region to build, to carve, to arrange massive stones in patterns whose meaning we can only guess at. The labour required to construct Göbekli Tepe exceeds what any small band could accomplish. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, carving and erecting these pillars keys demanded coordination among hundreds of people, possibly thousands, working toward a shared goal across extended periods of time. Someone organised this labour, someone designed the layouts, someone maintained the social structures necessary to bring people together, feed them while they worked, and ensure the project continued across what must have been years or decades of effort. And they did this 6,000 years before Sumer, in an era when conventional archaeology assumed humans lack the capacity for such achievements. The question is no longer whether sophisticated human societies existed before the civilizations that left written records. Göbekli Tepe proves they did. The obsidian trade networks prove they did. The shells and beads and carved stones scattered across 10,000 years of archaeological deposits prove they did. The question has shifted to something more troubling. How sophisticated were these pre-literate societies? What were they capable of? And what happened to them? Why did their achievements leave so few traces? Why do we know so little about cultures that could quarry 15-ton stones and move volcanic glass across hundreds of miles? The standard answer is that these achievements, impressive as they are, still fall short of true civilization. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, the argument goes, people without agriculture, without permanent settlements, without the economic surplus that enables specialised labour and social hierarchy. The obsidian traders were participants in down-the-line exchange, passing materials from hand to hand across short distances, never themselves travelling far or organising complex expeditions. These answers preserve the conventional timeline, maintaining the primacy of Sumerian and Egyptian civilization as the first true achievements of organised human society. But the answers are growing increasingly strained as new evidence accumulates. Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated phenomenon. Similar sites are being discovered across southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, suggesting a pattern of monumental construction that extended across a wide region for centuries or millennia. The labour organisation required for these projects implies social complexity that fits poorly with standard models of hunter-gatherer society. And the sudden burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BC, the deliberate filling in of the stone circles with rubble and debris, raises questions about what happened to the culture that built it, and why they chose to hide their achievement from future generations. When the Sumerians rose to prominence in the 4th millennium BC, they inherited a landscape already marked by the millennia of human activity. The temple mounds they built upon contained the bones of earlier populations. The trade routes they used had been established thousands of years before. The agricultural systems they managed had been developed by cultures whose names we do not know, and whose languages left only substrate traces in Sumerian vocabulary. The Sumerians were not the first, they were not even close to the first. They were inheritors of a tradition stretching back at least 10,000 years, building on foundations laid by peoples whose achievements we are only beginning to recognize, and the gods they claimed had created humanity arrived in a landscape already shaped by human hands, already organized by human minds, already marked by monuments that predated the Anunnaki by 6,000 years. In 946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar began systematic excavations at Eridu, the city that Sumerian tradition named as the first seat of kingship, the place where civilization descended from heaven. The site rises from the flat Mesopotamian plain as a low mound, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but beneath its surface lay 18 distinct levels of temple construction, each built upon the foundations of the one before, creating a continuous record of religious practice stretching across nearly 3,000 years. Safar and his colleagues worked their way downward through these levels, documenting the architectural changes, the evolution of floor plans, the gradual increase in complexity from simple shrines to elaborate temple complexes. Level by level they descended through time, from the sophisticated structures of the Uruk period to simpler antecedents, from the clearly Sumerian to something older and stranger. And beneath Temple the 16, the earliest structure that could reasonably be called a temple, they found human burials. The bodies had been interred before the first temple was built, before the sacred precinct was established, before whatever divine presence the Sumerians recognized at Eridu took up residence. The burials were not Sumerian. The grave goods were different, the burial positions were different, the ceramic styles were different. These were the remains of the Ubaid culture, a people who occupied southern Mesopotamia from approximately 6500 to 3800 BC, long before the Sumerians arrived or emerged, or whatever process brought Sumerian civilization into being. The Ubaid people built the foundations that the Sumerians inherited. Every major Sumerian temple site, when excavated to sufficient depth, reveals Ubaid occupation beneath. At Eridu, at Ur, at Uruk, at Nippur, the pattern repeats. Ubaid pottery, Ubaid architecture, Ubaid burials lying beneath the temples that would later be attributed to divine foundation, to gods who descended from heaven to establish sacred places on earth. The temples were not founded by divine beings, they were built over the graves of an earlier population. The sacred sites were not chosen by divine wisdom, they were inherited from a people who lived and died and worshipped in those locations for nearly 3 millennia before Sumerian culture existed in recognizable form. This should not be controversial. Archaeological continuity from Ubaid to Sumerian periods is well documented, discussed in academic literature, taught in university courses on Mesopotamian prehistory. But somehow this continuity rarely affects how we discuss Sumerian mythology, how we interpret the creation narratives, how we understand the claims of divine origin that the texts make. We compartmentalize. The archaeology tells one story, the mythology tells another, and we treat them as separate domains that need not be reconciled. The Ubaid culture remains enigmatic despite decades of study. They built in mud brick, leaving no monumental stone architecture that could survive millennia of weathering and reuse. Their temples were modest by later standards, small structures that served as the nuclei around which larger complexes would eventually grow. They practiced agriculture, maintained irrigation systems, developed pottery traditions of remarkable sophistication. Their culture spread across southern Mesopotamia and beyond, reaching into northern Iraq, into the Gulf region, wherever their distinctive painted ceramics appear in archaeological deposits. And they made figurines. This is where the Ubaid evidence becomes genuinely strange, where the archaeological record offers something that resists easy explanation. The figurines are human in form but not quite human in feature. Elongated heads slope backward to an exaggerated degree. Eyes are represented as slits or ovals, placed at angles that give the faces a vaguely reptilian appearance. The figures are often depicted holding infants whose heads show the same elongation, the same strange proportions. Bodies are slender, shoulders narrow. The overall impression is of something not quite human wearing human form. Scholars typically explain these figurines as representations of cranial deformation, a practice documented in various cultures where infants' heads are deliberately bound to produce elongated skulls. This is possible. Cranial deformation has been practiced around the world at different times, and elongated skulls do appear in some archaeological contexts, but the Ubaid figurines show other features that deformation cannot explain: the eye placement, the facial proportions, the overall impression of something other than ordinary human form. Another explanation suggests that the figurines represent shamanic transformation. humans depicted in the process of taking on animal characteristics for ritual purposes. This too is possible. Shamanic traditions often involve identification with animal spirits, and the vaguely reptilian features could represent such transformation. But the figurines are remarkably consistent across time and space, showing the same characteristics for nearly 2,000 years across a wide geographic area. This suggests not individual shamanic experience, but a standardized representation of something the Ubaid people recognized and wanted to depict. The honest answer is that we do not know what these figurines represent. They could be deformed humans, shamans, deities, ancestors, or something else entirely. But their presence beneath every major Sumerian temple site raises questions about continuity and inheritance, about what the Ubaid people believed and how those beliefs may have influenced or been absorbed by later Sumerian religion. When the Sumerians built their temples, they were not building on virgin ground. They were building over the graves of the Ubaid dead, over the broken remains of Ubaid figurines, over the accumulated deposits of a culture that had worshipped at these locations for 3,000 years. Whatever the Ubaid believed about elongated heads and slitted eyes, whatever they saw when they made these figurines, became part of the sacred geography that Sumerian religion would inherit and transform. Foundation deposits tell a similar story. When ancient builders began a new structure, they often placed offerings beneath the foundations, objects meant to protect the building, to ensure divine favour, to connect the new construction with sacred tradition. Sumerian temples contain foundation deposits of elaborate design, figurines and tablets and ceremonial objects placed with ritual precision. But earlier deposits lie beneath, Ubaid artifacts interred by people who performed similar rituals for similar purposes with different objects and presumably different theological meanings. The temples were not founded, they were inherited. The sacred sites were not chosen by gods descending from heaven. They were chosen by humans who had lived and died and worshipped at these locations for millennia, accumulating sanctity through generations of use, creating sacred geography through the slow deposit of ritual practice. When the Sumerian texts describe divine foundation, they are describing not the origin of these sites, but the appropriation of these sites, the moment when a new theological system claimed authority over places that already held religious significance for populations that preceded the arrival of Sumerian culture. And beneath all of this, beneath the Sumerian temples and the Ubaid graves and the enigmatic figurines, lies the fundamental question: who were the Ubaid people? Where did they come from? Why did their culture spread so widely across southern Mesopotamia? And what happened to them when Sumerian civilization arose on the foundations they had built? The Ubaid culture did not disappear in any simple sense. Archaeological evidence shows gradual transition rather than sudden replacement. Ubaid pottery styles evolved into Uruk styles without sharp breaks. Settlement patterns continued. The temples grew larger but remained on the same sites. Yet something changed. The Ubaid identity, whatever that meant to the people who possessed it, was absorbed into something else, transformed into the substrate upon which Sumerian civilization would build its claims of divine origin and cosmic significance. The bones beneath the temples are the bones of people who were not Sumerian, who lived and died before Sumerian culture existed, who built the first shrines at locations that would become the most sacred sites in Mesopotamian religion. They were present before the gods arrived. They were present before kingship descended from heaven. They were present before the creation narratives were composed to explain a world that these narratives could not actually account for. And their presence, silent but undeniable, challenges everything the later texts would claim about the origins of humanity and civilization. The Sumerian language stands alone in the linguistic history of humanity. An orphan with no known relatives, no family tree, no ancestors or descendants that scholars can identify with confidence. Every other major language of the ancient Near East belongs to a family. Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew, Arabic, all are Semitic languages, related to each other through regular sound changes and shared vocabulary, descendants of a common ancestor spoken thousands of years before any of them were written down. Indo-European languages, Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin, connect across vast distances of space and time, their relationships traceable through careful comparison. Even language isolates like Basque, which has no known relatives, can be understood as survivors, remnants of populations that once spoke related languages since replaced by Indo-European expansion. But Sumerian fits nowhere It is not Semitic. It is not Indo-European. It is not related to any other language ever discovered, living or dead, ancient or modern. Its grammar is agglutinative, building words through chains of prefixes and suffixes attached to stable roots. Its phonology, as far as we can reconstruct it, shares no obvious patterns with neighbouring languages. Its vocabulary, with important exceptions we will examine, cannot be traced to any external source. When scholars first deciphered Sumerian in the 19th century, they expected to find connections. Surely this language, spoken in the cradle of civilization, would relate to something else. Perhaps it was early Semitic, the ancestor of Akkadian. Perhaps it connected to Elamite, its neighbour to the east. Perhaps some Indo-European relationship would emerge, connecting Sumer to the broader sweep of linguistic history. None of these expectations were fulfilled. The more Sumerian was studied, the more isolated it appeared. By the 20th century, the scholarly consensus solidified. Sumerian is a language isolate, unrelated to any known language family, its origins a mystery that may never be solved. This isolation is linguistically extraordinary, nearly unique in the history of human language. Languages do not normally appear from nowhere. They evolve from earlier languages, which evolve from still earlier languages, creating family trees that can be traced back for millennia, even when the ancestor languages were never written. The fact that we cannot find Sumerian's relatives means either that its family was so thoroughly erased that nothing remains, not a single descendant, not a single fragment of a related tongue, or that Sumerian arrived in Mesopotamia fully formed, brought by migrants from some unknown homeland where its relatives may still remain undiscovered. Neither option is comfortable. Complete erasure of an entire language family seems improbable given how many other ancient languages survived in some form, or left traces in loanwords and substrate vocabulary. An arrival fully formed raises its own questions from where did the Sumerians come? What happened to their linguistic relatives? Why did they leave no trace of their migration in the archaeological record? But beneath the mystery of Sumerian's isolation lies another mystery, one that may be even more significant for understanding the deep history of Mesopotamia. While Sumerian vocabulary is mostly unique, untraceable to external sources, scholars have identified a subset of words that do not appear to be originally Sumerian. These are substrate words, terms borrowed from an earlier language that was spoken in Mesopotamia before Sumerian arrived or emerged. The substrate is most visible in vocabulary related to local features, the physical landscape, the plants and animals, the material culture of southern Mesopotamia. Words for local rivers and geographical features often show non-Sumerian phonological patterns. Terms for certain crops, for fishing technologies, for building materials, seem to derive from a source outside the Sumerian linguistic system. The implication is clear. Someone was speaking a language in Mesopotamia before Sumerian, a language that left traces in the vocabulary that Sumerian speakers borrowed when they arrived in the region. This substrate population had names for the rivers, names for the plants, names for the fish and the reeds and the mud and the flood. When Sumerian speakers encountered this landscape, they did not coin all new terms from their own linguistic resources. They borrowed, they absorbed, they took the words that the earlier population used and made them part of their own vocabulary. The pattern of borrowing reveals something about the nature of the contact between Sumerian speakers and the substrate population. The borrowed words cluster in certain semantic domains: agriculture, fishing, local geography, material culture related to the southern Mesopotamian environment. These are not the words you would expect conquerors to borrow from a subjugated population. These are the words you would expect newcomers to learn from established residents, practical vocabulary for navigating a landscape the newcomers did not know, techniques for exploiting resources the newcomers had not previously encountered. Some scholars call this the farmer's words hypothesis, suggesting that Sumerian speakers were originally pastoralists or residents of a different ecological zone who moved into agricultural southern Mesopotamia and borrowed the agricultural vocabulary of the people already living there. The substrate population on this reading were the farmers, the people who had developed the irrigation techniques, the people who knew how to grow barley in a land of seasonal floods, the people who had already shaped the landscape before Sumerian culture emerged to claim it. But if this is true, where did the substrate population go? If their language was substantial enough to leave traces in Sumerian vocabulary, if they had developed the agricultural techniques that made southern Mesopotamian civilization possible, If they had named the rivers and the plants and the features of the landscape, why did their language not survive? Why do we have no texts in the substrate language, no inscription, no evidence of its continued use alongside Sumerian? The most common answer is that the substrate population was absorbed, their descendants becoming Sumerian speakers across generations of cultural contact, their language dying out as their children learned the prestige language of the developing civilization. This is a pattern attested throughout human history. Smaller populations absorbed into larger ones, their languages replaced even as their genes and cultural practices continue in modified form. But this answer raises further questions. Why was Sumerian the prestige language? What gave Sumerian speakers the cultural authority to establish their language as the dominant form, displacing the language of the people who had developed the agriculture, who had named the landscape, who had been living in southern Mesopotamia for centuries or millennia before Sumerian culture emerged? The Sumerian texts themselves offer an answer, though not one that conventional scholarship takes at face value. The texts claim divine origin. They claim that civilization descended from heaven, that kingship was a gift of the gods, that the Anunnaki established the fundamental institutions of Sumerian society. If we read these claims literally, Sumerian cultural authority came from divine endorsement. The gods chose Sumerian as the language of civilization, and the substrate population had no choice but to accept this divine decree. But we need not read the claims literally to find them useful. The texts reveal that the Sumerians themselves recognized a distinction between their culture and what preceded it. The divine claims are claims of differentiation, assertions that Sumerian civilization was not a natural evolution from earlier conditions but a new imposition, a system that descended from outside the normal flow of human development. Whether the outside was truly heaven or some more terrestrial source, the texts acknowledge that Sumerian civilization was not the first, was not the natural heir of what came before, was an arrival rather than an emergence. The substrate vocabulary confirms this reading archaeologically. The borrowed words are the evidence of presence, the linguistic trace of the population that named the rivers and developed the agriculture before Sumerian speakers came to dominate the region. Every time a Sumerian scribe wrote a word of substrate origin, they were unknowingly preserving the memory of the people who had lived in Mesopotamia first, the people whose language they had borrowed even as they erased it, the people whose presence the texts cannot acknowledge but cannot entirely conceal. And here is the deepest mystery. The substrate language is not just untraceable to Sumerian, it is untraceable to anything. The words that Sumerian borrowed from its predecessor show no connection to any other known language, ancient or modern. Elamite does not account for them. Semitic does not account for them. No language family that we know offers a home for the substrate vocabulary. The language of the first Mesopotamians, the people who were there before the Sumerians, is as isolated as Sumerian itself, an orphan beneath an orphan, a mystery beneath a mystery. Two languages with no relatives existing in the same landscape, one buried beneath the other like the bones beneath the temples. The linguistic evidence aligns with the archaeological evidence, both pointing to a population present in Mesopotamia before the cultures we can name, a population sophisticated enough to develop agriculture and name landscapes and create the foundations upon which later civilizations would build. And like the Ubaid beneath the Sumerian, like the burials beneath the temples, like the irrigation channels beneath the first settlements, this linguistic substrate is present but invisible, acknowledged only in fragments, preserved only in borrowed words whose origins the borrowers may not have understood. In a study room at the British Museum, away from the public galleries where tourists photograph the Rosetta Stone and the Parthenon marbles, scholars spend their careers staring at cuneiform tablets through magnifying glasses, tracing the wedge-shaped impressions that Mesopotamian. Scribes pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago. The work is painstaking, each sign requiring interpretation, each word demanding context, each translation carrying the weight of decisions made by scholars who may have misunderstood what they were reading. And nowhere is this burden heavier than in the translation of words that seem simple but carry enormous conceptual freight. The word create is one such burden. When we read that the gods created humanity, we bring to that reading millennia of theological assumption, the weight of Genesis, the concept of ex nihilo creation from nothing, the image of divine power speaking existence into being where before there was only void. But the Sumerian scribes who composed these texts had no such concept. Their language worked differently, their cosmology worked differently, and when we translate their words as create, we may be importing meanings they never intended. The Sumerian term most commonly translated as create is nigdimdim ma, a compound form built from the root dim, meaning up to fashion, to form, to shape. The same root appears in contexts that have nothing to do with cosmic creation. It describes the work of potters shaping clay on wheels. It describes metalworkers forming bronze into tools. It describes sculptors carving stone into statues. In every case, the meaning is not creation from nothing but transformation of something that already exists, the imposition of form upon material that was present before the fashioning began. When the Atrahasis describes the fashioning of humanity, it uses precisely this language. Mami, the mother goddess, takes clay and mixes it with the blood of a slaughtered god. She shapes this mixture into forms. She fashions humans from the combined material. At no point does the text suggest that either the clay or the blood came from nothing. Both were present before the fashioning began. The clay was clay, earthly material of the kind that potters used, daily. The blood came from Wa'ila, a god killed specifically to provide the divine component of the mixture. The act described is not creation ex nihilo. It is transformation, the reshaping of existing materials into new forms. This distinction matters enormously for how we understand what the texts are actually claiming. If the gods created humanity from nothing, then humans had no existence before divine action brought them into being. But if the gods fashioned humanity from pre-existing material, then something was already present, something that could be shaped, transformed, modified into the beings that would carry the divine blood and perform the labour the gods required. The clay is typically read as metaphor, a poetic way of describing the earthly nature of human bodies, but metaphors are chosen for reasons. Why clay specifically? Why the material that potters work, the substance that can be shaped when wet and hardened when dry, the medium that takes form from external pressure, rather than generating form from within? The choice of clay suggests passivity, suggests material awaiting shaping, suggests existence without form rather than non-existence. And the blood is even more suggestive. The Atrahasis is explicit that the blood came from a god, that divine essence was mixed with earthly substance to produce humanity. But blood is not a creative force in isolation. Blood carries something, transmits something, links the vessel that contains it to the source from which it came. When modern readers encounter the mixing of blood with clay, some hear echoes of genetic modification, the insertion of divine genetic material into an existing biological substrate. This reading may be anachronistic, projecting modern concepts onto ancient texts, but it is not necessarily wrong. The scribes described what they understood in the language available to them. They may have been recording traditions that originated in observations they could not fully explain, memories of processes whose mechanisms were beyond their knowledge, but whose results they could describe in terms of mixing and fashioning and transformation. Consider how the text describes the result. The fashioned humans are not entirely new beings sprung from nothing. They carry the spirit of the slaughtered god. They have the drum, a term scholars interpret as heartbeat or pulse or some form of vital consciousness, linked to the divine component of their makeup. They are composites, earthly and divine, material and spiritual, clay given animation by blood. This is not the creation of something from nothing. This is the modification of something that existed into something new. If we read the texts with this understanding, the logical problems of the creation narratives begin to resolve. The humans who generated unbearable noise shortly after being fashioned did not spring from a small created population that somehow exploded to civilization-scale numbers in impossibly short time. They were the clay, the pre-existing population, the substrate upon which divine modification was performed. Some were fashioned, others remained unfashioned. And the conflict that runs through Mesopotamian mythology, the tension between gods who would preserve humanity and gods who would destroy it, makes sense as a conflict over a mixed population. Some modified, some original, some carrying divine blood, others merely human. The scribes who composed these texts may not have understood the full implications of what they were recording. They inherited traditions from earlier periods, stories passed down across centuries, accounts of events that had become legendary by the time they were written. They used the vocabulary available to them, words like deem that meant fashioning rather than creating, descriptions of mixing and shaping rather than speaking into existence. And their vocabulary preserved something that later translators obscured: the possibility that creation was not the origin of humanity but its transformation, not the beginning of human existence but its modification into something new. Modern translations typically render these passages using the word create because that is what English readers expect when reading about divine action concerning human origins. But every such translation is an interpretation, a choice to use a word that carries meanings the original may not have intended. When we read that the gods created humanity, we should remember that the scribes wrote that the gods fashioned humanity, shaped humanity, formed humanity from materials that were already present. The difference is not merely semantic, it is the difference between humans having no existence before divine action and humans having a different kind of existence before divine modification. The clay was already clay, the question is what the clay was before the blood was added. The phrase appears on line after line of the Atrahasis tablets, the complaint that drove the gods to take action, the problem that led first to creation, and then to destruction, and then to the uneasy accommodation that defines human existence in Mesopotamian thought. The land became wide, the people became numerous, the land bellowed like wild oxen. In cuneiform, the phrase is compact and vivid, the sign for land followed by the sign for bellowing. The image of a domesticated landscape suddenly become wild and uncontrollable. The noise is rigmu, uproar, clamour, the sound of too many voices, too much activity, too much existence concentrated in too small a space. Enlil, chief of the gods, found this noise unbearable. He could not sleep. He could not maintain the cosmic order that was his responsibility. Something had to be done about the human population whose racket disturbed divine rest. This is typically read as a mythological explanation for natural disasters, the floods and plagues that periodically devastated Mesopotamian populations reframed as divine responses to human overcrowding. But read carefully, with attention to the timeline the text provides, the narrative contains a mathematical impossibility that the scribes either did not notice or did not care to explain. The Atrahasis gives us a framework. Humans were created. 1200 years passed. The population grew to the point where the noise became unbearable. Enlil attempted population control through plague. This failed. He attempted it through drought. This failed. He attempted it through famine. This failed. Finally, he decreed the flood, the destruction of all humanity, which Enki subverted by warning Atrahasis to build a boat and preserve life. 1200 years is the time frame the text provides for humanity to grow from a created population to a civilization so vast and clamorous that it disturbed cosmic order. But 1200 years is approximately 60 human generations. Even with aggressive reproduction, even with ideal conditions, even with no infant mortality and every woman bearing children throughout her fertile years, the mathematics of population growth cannot produce the kind of civilization the text describes in 60 generations. Start with any reasonable created population, even 1,000 individuals, even 10,000, and compound them at any realistic growth rate. After 60 generations you might have a substantial population, but you would not have the kind of urban civilization that generates noise loud enough to disturb the gods, the kind of population density that requires divine intervention to control, the kind of clamorous multitude that bellows like wild oxen. The numbers do not work. They especially do not work given the population control measures the text describes. Between creation and the flood, Enlil sent plague, many died. He sent drought, many died. He sent famine, many died. Each intervention reduced the population, set back the growth curve, created gaps that would take generations to refill, yet somehow despite these setbacks, the population continued to grow, continued to generate unbearable noise, continued to require ever more drastic interventions. The only way this mathematics works is if the population was already large before the creation narrative begins. If humans already numbered in the hundreds of thousands or millions before the gods fashioned them, before the mixing of blood and clay, before the transformation described in the creation passages, then the timeline makes sense. A large pre-existing population, modified through divine action, would naturally continue to grow. Population control measures might reduce numbers temporarily, but would not eliminate the underlying mass of humanity that predated divine intervention. The creation was not the origin of humans. It was the modification of humans who already existed. The noise that disturbed the gods was not the noise of a newly created species rapidly multiplying beyond control. It was the noise of a population that had been present, all along, that had grown to civilization scale before the gods arrived, that generated the clamour of human existence regardless of divine preferences or interventions. And this reframes the flood entirely. In the conventional reading, the flood is divine punishment for human failure, for the sin of being too numerous, too loud, too present. But if humans already existed before divine modification, the flood was not punishment. It was failed management. It was an attempt to reduce a pre-existing population that had grown beyond the capacity of divine governance to control. Enlil did not want to destroy what he had created. Enlil wanted to destroy what had been there before he claimed authority over it. Enki's role in the narrative becomes comprehensible through this lens. In the standard reading, Enki's preservation of Atrahasis is an act of divine mercy, a god choosing to save the species he helped fashion against the will of his fellow deities. But if some humans were modified and others were not, if the fashioned humans were a subset of a larger population, Enki's action takes on different meaning. He was not saving humanity as a species, he was saving the modified humans, the ones who carried divine blood, the ones who had been fashioned to serve as intermediaries between divine and earthly realms. The rest, the unfashioned, the purely human, the clay without blood, could be allowed to perish. The flood was not a failed attempt to destroy all humanity. It was a successful attempt to reset the balance, to eliminate most of the pre-existing population while preserving the modified lineage through which divine authority could continue to operate. After the flood, Atrahasis and his descendants repopulated the earth, but they did so as fashioned humans, as carriers of divine blood, as the lineage through which the gods would maintain their relationship with the human world. Whatever pre-existed the modification, whatever population had generated the noise that disturbed Enlil, whatever humans had lived and multiplied before divine blood was mixed with earthly clay, was largely eliminated, reduced to remnants, pushed to the margins of a world now dominated by the fashioned ones. This reading is speculative. The texts do not state it directly, but the texts contain a mathematical impossibility that requires some explanation, and this explanation resolves the impossibility while making sense of other details that conventional readings leave unexplained. The noise came from somewhere. The population that generated it existed before the timeline the creation narratives provide, and the flood, rather than being a failed punishment, becomes a successful restructuring, the elimination of one humanity and the preservation of another. Sumerian scribes developed multiple terms for human beings, and the distinctions they made reveal assumptions about human nature and human categories that rarely receive the attention they deserve. The most common term, lu, is generic, meaning simply personal human applicable to any individual regardless of origin or status. But other terms carry more specific implications, defining not just humanity in general, but particular kinds of humanity, categories that may reflect beliefs about different human origins or different relationships to divine authority. The term Sag-Gig appears throughout Sumerian literature, sometimes translated as black-headed people, sometimes as dark-headed ones, always referring specifically to the Sumerians themselves, the civilized population living in cities, following Sumerian law, worshipping Sumerian gods. The colour reference is debated, possibly referring to hair colour, possibly to some other physical characteristic, possibly serving as a simple marker of ethnic or cultural identity without literal chromatic meaning. But what matters more than the precise meaning is the fact of the distinction. The Sumerians had a term for themselves that differentiated them from other humans. When Sumerian texts speak of Sag-Gig, they are not speaking of humanity in general. They are speaking of a specific population, the civilized, the city-dwelling, the ones who belong to the system of temples and kings and divine governance that defined Sumerian society. And by implication, other humans existed who did not belong to this system, who were not Sag-Gig, who stood outside the boundaries the term created. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides the most vivid illustration of this distinction through the character of Enkidu, the wild man created by the gods as a companion and rival for Gilgamesh. Enkidu's introduction is remarkable. He is described as living in the wilderness, running with the gazelles, eating grass like the animals, drinking at water holes alongside wild beasts. He is human in form but not in culture, possessing the body of a man but lacking the habits, the knowledge, the social identity that would make him civilized. The text describes Enkidu's transformation from wild to civilized through his encounter with a temple prostitute who teaches him the ways of humanity. She gives him bread instead of grass, she gives him beer instead of wild water. She teaches him language and custom and social behavior. And through this transformation, Enkidu becomes fit to enter the city to meet Gilgamesh, to participate in the civilization from which he had been entirely separate. What does Enki-Edu represent? The conventional reading treats him as a literary device, a character invented to serve narrative purposes, a foil for Gilgamesh whose wildness highlights the king's civilization. But Enkidu's wildness is described in terms that suggest something more than literary invention. He exists outside divine civilization but is still human. He lives without the benefits of divine governance but is not subhuman. He represents a category of humanity that is possible, perhaps actual, perhaps present in the world beyond the city walls. The texts acknowledge that some humans lived outside of the Sumerian system. Nomads in the desert, mountain dwellers in the eastern highlands, peoples beyond the reach of irrigation and urban organization all appear in Sumerian literature as human but different, civilizable but not yet civilized, existing in a state that the fashioned humanity of the cities had supposedly transcended. These others are never quite enemies and never quite equals, they are potential, humanity without the divine modification that created the Saggig, the raw material from which civilized humans were fashioned, but which, in their case, had never undergone the transformation. If we take this distinction seriously, if we read the multiple Sumerian terms for humanity as reflecting actual beliefs about human categories rather than merely literary convenience, a picture emerges that aligns with the evidence we have already assembled. Some humans were fashioned, modified, given divine blood, incorporated into the system of temples and cities and divine governance. These were the Saggig, the black-headed people, the Sumerians themselves. Other humans remained unfashioned, unmodified, living in the wilderness like Enkidu or in the peripheral regions that lay beyond Sumerian authority. These were still human but differently human, lacking the divine component that defined civilized humanity, existing in a state that preceded the modification the creation narratives describe. The creation of humanity was not the creation of all humanity, it was the creation of a particular humanity, a selected group, a modified lineage designed to serve divine purposes in a world where other humans already existed. The unfashioned continued to exist alongside the fashioned, sometimes entering civilization through processes like Enkidu's transformation, sometimes remaining outside, sometimes serving as the labor force or slave population that kept the cities running while the Saggig occupied positions of religious and political authority. This reading helps explain another puzzle in Sumerian social structure. The temples and palaces required vast labor forces, workers to dig canals and build walls and process grain and manufacture goods. These workers are largely invisible in the ideological texts, the hymns and myths that describe the relationship between gods and the Saggig. But they appear in administrative documents, in labor quotas and ration lists and records of deployment. They were human. They lived in or near the cities. They performed the work that maintained civilization. But they were not quite the same as the temple priests or the palace officials or the scribes who recorded the myths of divine creation. Were they the unfashioned, the descendants of the pre-existing population, the humans who carried only clay, not blood? The texts do not answer directly, but the structure of Sumerian society, with its sharp divisions between those who served the gods and those who served the gods, suggests a stratification that may reflect beliefs about different human origins. The fashioned commanded, the unfashioned laboured, divine blood conveyed authority, clay alone conveyed obligation. The mystery bifurcates. There was not one humanity but two, not one creation but a modification that touched some and left others unchanged. Not one origin, but a division that persists through Sumerian literature and social structure. Visible in vocabulary, visible in Enki-Edu, visible in the vast anonymous labour forces that built the ziggurats, while the Saggig claimed divine descent and cosmic significance. In the red rock country of Australia's Northern Territory, on sheltered cliff faces and within caves that have provided refuge from sun and storm for tens of thousands of years, paintings survive that challenge everything we assume about the timeline of human achievement. Some of these images date to 40,000 years before present, making them among the oldest known, artistic expressions of human consciousness, created when glaciers still covered much of Europe, and anatomically modern humans had only recently reached the Australian continent. The paintings depict animals and plants and human figures, but they also depict something else, beings that Aboriginal elders describe as the creators of the world, the dreaming ancestors who shaped the land and established the law that governs existence. These dreaming beings are not gods in the Western sense, not supernatural entities dwelling in some separate realm, but rather the original inhabitants of a formless world who travelled across the land, singing it into shape, creating mountains where they rested, rivers where they urinated, valleys where they slept. Their journeys created the features of the landscape, and their stories created the framework of meaning within which Aboriginal peoples have lived for longer than any other continuous culture on Earth. But here is what conventional discussions of Aboriginal spirituality often overlook. The dreaming narratives do not describe the creation of humanity, they describe the creation of the world in the presence of humanity. The dreaming ancestors found humans already here. They taught humans law and ceremony and proper behaviour. They gave humans the sacred sites and the songlines that connect those sites across the landscape. But they did not make humans. The humans were already present, already watching, already receiving the gifts of culture and meaning that the dreaming beings provided. This is not creation mythology in the way that Western traditions use the term. This is contact mythology. This is the record of an encounter between humans who already existed and beings who arrive bringing knowledge and law and the organisation of the world. The dreaming did not generate human life. It organised human life that was already present. Aboriginal Australian tradition represents one of the oldest continuous religious systems on Earth, preserved through oral transmission across at least 40,000 years, perhaps longer. And throughout that immense span of time, the tradition has maintained its central claim that humans were here first, that the creators found us rather than made us, that our existence predates the arrival of the beings who shaped our world and taught us how to live in it. Across the African continent, similar patterns emerge in traditions that developed entirely independently of Australian belief systems. The Dogon people of Mali speak of the Nomo, beings who came from the sky to teach humanity the arts of civilization. But the Dogon creation narratives make clear that humans existed before the Nomo arrived, that the teachers came to a world already populated, that their role was instruction rather than creation. The Zulu traditions of southern Africa speak of Unkulunkulu, the Ancient One, who emerged from the primordial reed bed. But human beings did not emerge from Unkulunkulu. Rather, Unkulunkulu emerged into a world where humans and other beings already existed in potential form, waiting to be organised and given purpose. The San peoples of the Kalahari, whose traditions may be as old as any on Earth, speak of Kagan, the trickster creator, whose stories explain how the world came to be ordered. But Kagan did not create humans from nothing. He shaped a world in which humans were already implicated, already present as figures in the landscape that would later receive its meaning. The pattern repeats. Humans first, teachers second. Beings arrive into a populated world. They bring knowledge, culture, law, the arts of civilization. But they do not bring life itself. Life was already here, already human, already waiting to receive what the arriving teachers had to offer. Why would cultures separated by oceans, cultures that had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years, independently invent this same pattern? If creation mythology is merely projection of human psychology, merely the primitive attempt to explain existence through supernatural narrative, why do the resulting narratives across unconnected cultures share this specific structure? Why humans first and teachers second? Why contact rather than creation? The conventional explanation is that these cultures are describing the transmission of culture between human groups, that the teachers represent more advanced human populations who brought new technologies and social organisation to peoples who already existed. This is plausible for some cases, but it cannot explain the universality of the pattern. Aboriginal Australians were the first humans to reach their continent. There was no more advanced human population to bring them civilization. Yet their traditions still speak of beings who arrived bringing knowledge to humans who were already present. The pattern is not reducible to intercultural contact between human groups. It describes something older, something more fundamental, a memory preserved across unimaginable spans of time, a claim that humans existed before the structures of civilization that would later define human society. The teachers came later, Hamur, whoever or whatever they were. bringing the gifts that would organize human existence. But existence itself was already ours, already present, already human long before any teacher arrived to shape it. In the wetlands of southern Chile, at a site called Monte Verde, archaeologists in the 1970s discovered evidence that revolutionized our understanding of human presence in the Americas. The site preserved organic material with remarkable clarity, including wooden structures, plant remains, and stone tools, all dated to approximately 14,500 years before present. This predates by at least 1,000 years the Clovis culture that archaeologists had long considered the first human presence in the Americas. The Clovis first hypothesis had dominated American archaeology for decades, proposing that humans entered the Americas across the Bering Land Bridge approximately 13,500 years ago and spread rapidly southward, reaching South America only a few centuries later. Monte Verde demolished this hypothesis. Humans were in southern Chile before the supposed first migration. They had already travelled the entire length of 2 continents. They had already established settlements and developed local adaptations. The Clovis migrants, if they existed as a distinct population, were not the first Americans. They were latecomers to a world already inhabited. Since Monte Verde, evidence has continued to push human presence in the Americas further back in time. Sites in Texas, Florida, and the Pacific Northwest have yielded dates of 15,000, 16,000, even 20,000 years before present. The pattern of evidence suggests that humans reached the Americas far earlier than conventional models allowed, possibly during the last glacial maximum, possibly by routes we have not yet identified. Americas were inhabited long before the cultures we recognize as civilizations arose. When Mesoamerican civilization emerged, with its pyramids and calendars and elaborate writing system, it did not emerge from nothing. It arose from populations that had inhabited the region for tens of thousands of years, populations whose descendants would later tell stories about how their world began. And those stories are revealing. The Aztec creation narratives describe humans emerging from the earth, rising from caves, born from the underworld into the world of the sun. This is not the same as being created by sky gods. This is emergence arising from within the earth rather than being made by beings from without. The humans came up from below. The world was already here. The sun and the structures of civilization came later. Gifts from beings who arrived to find humans already present. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the teacher god whose cult spread across Mesoamerica, is never described as creating humanity. He is described as teaching humanity, as bringing the arts of civilization to people who already existed, as providing the knowledge that transformed scattered populations into organized societies. The same patterns appears with Kukulkan among the Maya, with Viracocha among the Inca, with culture heroes across the Americas who arrived bringing gifts rather than creating recipients. The pyramid builders of Mesoamerica were not created by their gods, they were taught by them. The astronomers who track the movements of Venus across centuries of observation were not fashioned from nothing. They inherited traditions that stretched back into a past deeper than any mythology could reach. The mathematicians who invented zero, the scribes who developed writing, the architects who aligned structures with cosmic precision, all were products of human populations that had existed for thousands of years before the teacher gods arrived to augment their capabilities. Archaeological evidence confirms this reading. The earliest ceremonial centers in Mesoamerica, sites like San Lorenzo and La Venta, show development from earlier traditions. The Olmec did not invent civilization from nothing. They built on foundations laid by previous populations, elaborating and transforming practices that had accumulated over millennia. The famous colossal heads, with their distinctive features and elaborate headdresses, may represent kings or gods or something we cannot categorize, but they represent a culture that had already developed sophisticated organization, artistic skill, and social complexity before the period of monumental construction began. The inversion holds across oceans. In Mesopotamia, the texts describe gods creating or fashioning humans, but the archaeological evidence shows humans present before the gods arrived. In the Americas, the traditions describe teacher gods arriving to find humans already present, and the archaeological evidence confirms continuous human occupation stretching back tens of thousands of years before the emergence of recognizable civilization. The teachers came to an inhabited world. They augmented what already existed. They did not create from nothing but transformed something into something else. The passage appears in Genesis chapter 6, a few verses that have puzzled readers and scholars for millennia, interrupting the genealogical flow of the primordial narrative with a sudden intrusion of the strange and the cosmic. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the text reads, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. These were the heroes of old, warriors of renown. The passage is brief and tantalizing, offering no context, no explanation, no resolution. Who were the sons of God? What were the Nephilim? Why does the text mention them here, between genealogies and the flood narrative, without elaboration or follow-up? Scholarship has offered various interpretations. The sons of God might be fallen angels, divine beings who descended from heaven to mate with human women. They might be the descendants of Seth, the righteous line of Adam, intermarrying with the descendants of Cain. They might be kings or rulers, divine sons in the ancient Near Eastern sense of royalty claiming divine parentage. Each interpretation has supporters and problems, but amid all the scholarly debate, one feature of the passage rarely receives the attention it deserves. The daughters of humans already existed. When the sons of God came down, when the divine or semi-divine beings arrived on earth, they found human women already present, already producing daughters, already numerous enough to attract divine attention. The text does not describe the creation of these women. They are simply there, assumed, present before the narrative moment that introduces the sons of God. The passage assumes a pre-existing human population. This creates a problem for anyone attempting to read Genesis as a coherent linear narrative. The earlier chapters describe the creation of Adam and Eve, the first human beings, fashioned by God in the Garden of Eden. If all humanity descends from this single pair, if the creation of Adam and Eve marks the absolute origin of human existence, then the daughters of humans in chapter 6 must be descendants of that original pair, generations removed but still connected by unbroken lineage. But the passage does not read that way. It reads as though the daughters of humans were a population, a category, a humanity that existed in sufficient numbers and diversity to attract the attention of divine beings looking for mates. The heroes of old, the warriors of renown, the Nephilim themselves, emerge from this union between divine and human. They are the offspring, the products, the results of contact between beings from different categories. And this contact assumes that both categories already existed, that the divine beings came to a world where human women were present. That creation had already happened before the union that produced the famous heroes. The biblical flood narrative, which follows immediately after this passage, parallels the Mesopotamian flood traditions in ways that scholars have long recognized. Both describe divine displeasure with humanity. Both involve a single righteous man warned to build a boat. Both culminate in catastrophic destruction and new beginning. The connections are so close that many scholars consider the Genesis flood a reworking of Mesopotamian originals, adapted to the theological context of Israelite monotheism. But the Mesopotamian flood traditions, as we have seen, contain the same logical problem as the Genesis account. The population that generated divine displeasure, that became too numerous and too loud, could not have grown to such scale in the time the narratives provide if humanity began from a small created population. The flood responds to pre-existing humanity, not to recently created humanity. And the daughters who attracted the sons of God were part of this pre-existing population, present before divine intervention, human in a sense that predates the modifications the creation narratives describe. Even within the biblical text itself, the pattern we have traced through Mesopotamian and global traditions appears. Humans existed before the significant divine contact. The daughters were already there when the sons came down. The population was already vast enough to trouble divine order. The creation narrative and the flood narrative assume different timelines, different populations, different relationships between divine and human. The contradiction is present in the most familiar text of Western civilization, hidden in plain sight for millennia, waiting for readers to notice what the words actually say. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The daughters of humans were available to bear children. To the sons of God, humanity was already present, already fertile, already generating the daughters who would become mothers of heroes. Whatever creation means in the earlier chapters of Genesis, it does not mean the absolute origin of human existence. Something was already here. Someone was already human. The divine intervention that followed, whether fashioning in Mesopotamia or union in Genesis, operated on a substrate that preceded it. In conference rooms and lecture halls around the world, archaeologists and ancient historians gather to debate interpretations of the evidence we have examined. The debates are often heated, the stakes high, the implications profound. What does it mean if humans existed before the narratives that claim to describe human origins? What does it mean if creation is better understood as modification, contact, transformation of something already present? The scholarly community offers multiple interpretations, each compelling in its own way, each struggling with aspects of the evidence that resist easy accommodation. The first interpretation treats the texts as purely mythological, as theological poetry rather than historical record. On this reading, the inconsistencies and contradictions we have noted are simply the result of mythological thinking, which operates by different rules than historical analysis. Myths are not required to be logically consistent. They serve psychological and social functions, explaining existence and providing meaning without needing to align with archaeological evidence or mathematical probability. The noise that disturbed the gods is a mythological motif, not a historical claim. The cities named before creation are literary devices, not evidence of pre-existing urbanism. The substrate vocabulary in Sumerian reflects normal language contact, not hidden populations. This interpretation has the advantage of simplicity and aligns with how mainstream scholarship has traditionally treated ancient creation narratives, but it struggles to explain the global pattern of humans first and teachers second across unconnected cultures. If mythology operates by universal psychological rules, why do independently developed mythologies share this specific structure? The second interpretation proposes that creation narratives describe cultural integration rather than biological origin. On this reading, the gods did not create humans biologically, but rather created civilization, incorporating pre-existing populations into organized society. The fashioning of humans was the fashioning of citizens, the transformation of scattered groups into structured communities under divine law. The Sumerians emerged not from divine biological engineering, but from cultural revolution, a new way of organizing society that swept across southern Mesopotamia and absorbed earlier populations. This interpretation explains the archaeological continuity between Ubaid and Sumerian periods, the substrate vocabulary, the bones beneath the temples. It treats the text as accurate in their essential claim while reinterpreting what creation actually meant. But it struggles with the specificity of the creation narratives themselves, the mixing of blood with clay, the detailed descriptions of fashioning human form, the biological implications embedded in the accounts. The third interpretation ventures into more speculative territory, proposing that the Anunnaki narratives describe contact between advanced and developing human populations. On this reading, the gods were not supernatural beings, but rather members of a technologically sophisticated human civilization, perhaps survivors of an earlier high culture who encountered and modified less developed populations in Mesopotamia. The divine blood was genetic material, the fashioning was biological engineering, the noise that disturbed the gods was the chaos of a population that had grown beyond the capacity of the advanced population to manage. This interpretation accounts for the global pattern by proposing similar contact events across different regions, explaining the consistent structure of humans first and teachers second as reflecting actual historical experiences rather than psychological projection. But it requires accepting premises that mainstream scholarship rejects: the existence of advanced human civilization before the cultures we recognize as ancient, the capability for genetic modification in deep prehistory, the survival and transmission of accurate memory across tens of thousands of years. The fourth interpretation simply acknowledges that something happened which we cannot yet accommodate in our framework. The evidence points in directions that our current models cannot follow. The texts preserve information whose meaning we have lost. The archaeological record contains gaps that may never be filled. Whatever actually occurred in the deep past of human experience remains beyond our capacity to reconstruct with confidence. This interpretation has the virtue of honesty but the limitation of offering no positive claims. It marks the boundary of current knowledge without pushing beyond it. Each interpretation explains some evidence while struggling with other evidence. None can account for everything. The responsible scholar holds all possibilities in mind, weighing each against the full range of what we know and what we cannot know, resisting the temptation to premature certainty while remaining open to wherever the evidence leads. In the excavation trenches at sites across Mesopotamia, archaeologists sometimes encounter a distinctive layer of deposit, a stratum of sterile silt that separates earlier occupation levels from later ones. This silt layer represents flood, catastrophic inundation that covered the land and buried whatever lay beneath. At Ur, at Kish, at Shuruppak, the silt appears, marking boundaries in the archaeological record, dividing before from after. The deposits are not synchronous, occurring at different dates in different locations, suggesting multiple flood events rather than a single universal catastrophe. But their presence reminds us that the landscape of southern Mesopotamia was periodically devastated, that human occupation was interrupted and restarted, that whatever existed before the silt may have been fundamentally transformed by what the water left behind. Between Göbekli Tepe and Sumerian writing lies a gap of approximately 6,000 years. During those millennia, humans lived and died across the Near East. They built structures and made tools and developed traditions. They created the irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. They established the settlements that would become the first cities. They did everything that humans do, but they did it without writing, without leaving the textual records that allow us to understand what they believed and why. We have their material culture, their pottery and their buildings and their buried dead, but we do not have their words. We cannot know what they called themselves, what stories they told, what they believed about their origins and their purpose. 6,000 years of human experience lies largely silent, communicating only through the mute evidence of archaeology. What happened during those millennia? What rose and fell? What was lost that we will never recover? The texts we have, composed after 3000 BC, may themselves be fragments of fragments. The scribes who wrote the Atrahasis were copying from earlier sources. Those sources were copies of still earlier sources. The tradition stretched back into an oral past that these scribes themselves could not date or verify. Each copying introduced potential changes, errors, deliberate modifications, theological adjustments. What we read as Mesopotamian mythology may be the residue of something far older, transmitted imperfectly across centuries, preserving fragments of memory that the transmitters no longer fully understood. The flood layers in the archaeological record represent what catastrophe erases. The careful stratigraphy of earlier occupation disappears beneath sterile silt. Cultural continuity is broken. Whatever records might have existed, written on materials less durable than clay, vanish completely. Even clay tablets survive only when accidentally preserved, fired by the burning of the buildings that housed them, baked into permanence by the catastrophes that destroyed their original contexts. Most of what ancient peoples created has disappeared. Most of what they knew has been lost. Most of what they believed about their origins died with them. We work with fragments, tiny percentages of what once existed, trying to reconstruct wholes from parts that may not be representative, may not preserve the most important information, may mislead us precisely because of what they happen to leave out. The humans who lived before writing, who built Göbekli Tepe, and its sister sites who developed the irrigation systems and the agricultural techniques and the social organization that made Mesopotamian civilization possible, left no words for us to read. Their thoughts are silent. Their beliefs are invisible. Whatever they knew about their origins, whatever stories they told about how humanity came to be, and what relationship existed between humans and any other beings who may have shared their world, vanished when they vanished, preserved only in fragments that later cultures would inherit and transform beyond recognition. Before the abyss of unrecorded time, humility is the only honest response. We do not know what happened. We cannot know what happened. The evidence we have points in directions we can dimly perceive but cannot follow with confidence. Something occurred in the deep human past that the later texts attempt to describe, but those descriptions have been filtered through so many generations of transmission, have been modified by so many theological and political agendas, have been fragmented by so many catastrophes and reconstructions, that we cannot assume they accurately preserve the original form of what they report. The patterns are real, the contradictions are real. The evidence of human presence before the creation narratives begin is real. But what it all means, what actually happened, who or what the Anunnaki or the dreaming ancestors or the sons of God actually were, whether any of the traditions preserve genuine memory or are entirely the product of human imagination, we cannot say with certainty. We stand at the edge of the abyss, peering into darkness, seeing shapes that might be meaningful or might be our own projections, knowing that the truth lies somewhere in that darkness, but knowing also that we may never reach it. The honest inquiry does not end with answers, it ends with better questions, with clearer understanding of what we do not know, with humility before the vastness of human experience that stretches beyond our capacity to reconstruct. The humans were here first. This much the evidence suggests. What came after and why, and what it means for our understanding of who we are, remains the mystery that draws us forward into continued investigation. At Laetoli in northern Tanzania, preserved in volcanic ash that fell 3.6 million years ago, a trail of footprints crosses the ancient landscape. The prints are unmistakably bipedal, left by creatures walking upright across the ash while it was still soft, preserved when subsequent eruptions sealed them beneath protective layers of rock. These are not the footprints of Homo sapiens. Our species would not emerge for another 3 million years, but they are the footprints of our ancestors, beings who walked on two legs, who crossed the African savanna with a gait we would recognize, who left their mark on the earth before anything we would call human existed. The Laetoli footprints remind us of deep time, of the vast stretches of existence that preceded everything we consider historical. When we speak of human origins, we typically mean the origins of civilization, the emergence of cities and writing and organized religion within the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. But Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans indistinguishable from ourselves, has existed for approximately 300,000 years. We have walked the earth for 300 millennia, adapting to every environment, spreading across every continent, developing language and culture and social organization in ways we can only dimly reconstruct from archaeological evidence. The civilization we recognize, the temples and palaces and written records, represents approximately the last 2% of human existence. For the other 98%, humans lived without writing, without cities as we define them, without the institutional structures we consider essential to organized society, but they did not live without culture, without knowledge, without achievement. They created art that still moves us. They developed technologies that shaped the world. They accumulated wisdom about plants and animals and landscapes that exceeds anything modern science has recovered. They were fully human, fully capable, fully present in a world they shaped through 300,000 years of continuous existence. If any beings arrived in Mesopotamia 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, whether divine or advanced, or something we cannot categorize, they arrived into a world that humans had already occupied for 290,000 years. They were not the ancient ones. We were. They were not the established presence. We were. Whatever claims of creation or fashioning or origination they might have made, whatever narratives their arrival generated, those narratives obscure a fundamental fact. Humans were here first, by a margin so vast that the period of divine presence, if it occurred, represents a brief episode in a story that belongs to us. The arrogance of assuming we were created reverses the actual relationship. Creation narratives place divine beings at the origin, humans as the product, our existence depending on actions taken by others, but the timeline does not support this framing. The timeline shows human presence extending back into deep antiquity, through ice ages and warm periods, through catastrophes and recoveries, through transformations of landscape and climate that the arriving beings, whenever they arrived, never witnessed. We adapted, we survived, we persisted. We were the continuous presence, the ancient population, the established inhabitants of a world that any newcomer would have to negotiate rather than simply claim. If the Anunnaki or the Elohim or the dreaming ancestors or any other beings described in any tradition actually arrived at some point in the human past, they arrived as visitors to our world, not as creators of it. They may have brought knowledge, they may have introduced technologies, they may have modified some populations or established new social structures, but they did not create humanity. Humanity was already here, already ancient, already the inheritors of 300,000 years of experience when the visitors appeared. The creation narratives, read this way, are not origins but impositions. They are the stories that newcomers tell to establish authority over populations that preceded them. They are the theological claims that justify governance, that explain why certain beings have the right to command and others have the obligation to obey. They are not history, they are legitimation. And the true history, the 300 millennia of human existence before any divine claim was made, lies silent beneath the accumulated weight of narratives designed to make us forget that we were here first. In the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa, on rock faces sheltered from wind and rain, paintings survive that the Sand Peoples created over thousands of years. The images depict animals and humans and therianthropic figures that blend human and animal characteristics. They depict trance states and spiritual experiences and the transformed consciousness that shamanic practice induces. They represent one of the longest continuous artistic traditions on Earth, stretching back at least 20,000 years, perhaps much longer, preserved by the dry climate and the protected locations where the San created their sacred images. The San are among the oldest genetic populations on Earth, their ancestors having separated from other human lineages between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. Their oral traditions, their cultural practices, their ways of understanding the world represent something close to the deep ancestral heritage of all humanity. And their traditions do not describe human creation by divine beings. They describe a world in which humans have always existed, in which the boundaries between human and animal are permeable rather than fixed, in which spiritual beings are encountered rather than created by. Human memory extends reliably only to the edge of writing, approximately 5,000 years into the past for the oldest literate traditions. Beyond that edge, we depend on archaeology and oral tradition, both of which preserve information imperfectly and selectively. But oral traditions can be remarkably persistent, maintaining accurate information across millennia under the right conditions. Aboriginal Australian traditions provide the most striking evidence of this persistence. Researchers have documented Aboriginal stories that describe geographical features which have not existed for thousands of years, stories describing coastal landmarks now submerged by post-glacial sea level rise, stories describing volcanic eruptions that geological evidence dates to 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, stories that preserve accurate memory of landscape changes across hundreds of generations, transmitted from parent to child in unbroken chains of narrative tradition. If humans can remember the shape of coastlines that disappeared 7,000 years ago, what else might they remember? If oral tradition can preserve geological information across 300 generations, what cultural and historical information might have been preserved alongside it? The creation narratives we have examined present themselves as accounts of human origins, as the definitive story of how we came to be. But creation narratives are composed texts, written down at particular moments by particular authors with particular purposes. They are not raw tradition, they are traditions shaped by the theological and political context of their composition. What might humans have remembered about life before the beings who claimed to create them arrived? Where would such memory live if the traditions that preserved it were later reframed as accounts of divine creation? Perhaps the memory lives precisely in the details we have been examining, the inconsistencies and contradictions that reveal the presence of a prior population, the noise that came from humans who should not yet have existed in sufficient numbers to generate it, the cities named before creation supposedly occurred, the substrate vocabulary that indicates a language spoken before Sumerian, the bones beneath the temples that prove human presence predating divine foundation. Perhaps the creation myths themselves are the memory, inverted and reframed but still preserving the essential information. The conquered always become the created. When one population dominates another, when one culture subsumes another, the narratives change to reflect the new power relationships. The dominated population's own origin stories fade, replaced by stories that explain their existence as dependent on the dominators. What once was remembered as prior becomes narrated as derived. What once was known as ancient becomes described as fashioned. The memory of before survives, but disguised as its opposite, hidden within narratives that claim to describe creation, while actually preserving the trace of what existed before creation was claimed. Over the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, the night sky turns as it has turned for millennia, the same stars wheeling overhead that the Sumerian astronomers tracked with such precision, the same constellations that the Babylonians named and mythologized, the same cosmic patterns that humans have watched since long before any civilization arose to record their observations. The ziggurats have crumbled, the temples have fallen, the palaces of kings who claimed divine descent lie buried beneath the accumulated debris of centuries. The gods have departed, if indeed they ever arrived in the sense the later narratives claimed. What remains is human, only human, the descendants of whoever lived through the transformations that the texts describe, building new civilizations on the foundations of the old, remembering fragments of what came before while forgetting most of it, inheriting a world whose deep history they could not fully reconstruct. The Sumerian king list, that strange administrative document that records reigns of impossible length, shows a pattern that deserves more attention than it typically receives. In the Anti-diluvian period, kings reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns shortened dramatically, but remained superhuman, thousands of years at first, then hundreds. As the list approaches historical periods that can be verified through other sources, the reign lengths continue to decline, eventually reaching spans that correspond to ordinary human lifespans. The conventional interpretation treats this pattern as mythological inflation, early scribes attributing fantastic longevity to ancient kings as a form of glorification. But another reading is possible. Perhaps the pattern represents not inflation, but decline, not glorification, but loss. Perhaps the impossibly long reigns describe a period when something other than ordinary human governance operated, when the beings the texts call gods actually ruled, when the relationship between rulers and ruled differed fundamentally from anything that would follow. And perhaps the shortening reigns represent the gradual withdrawal of that extraordinary governance, the slow return to human scale, the restoration of ordinary human existence after an interruption whose nature we can no longer fully comprehend. The departure of the gods, if departure is the right word, might not be the tragedy the texts sometimes present. It might be the failure of an experiment, the recognition that whatever was attempted could not be sustained, that the population claimed as created could not be controlled, that the world asserted as divine property was never fully possessed. The noise that disturbed Enlil never ceased. The population the flood was meant to eliminate persisted. The humans who were supposed to serve the gods' purposes continued to pursue their own. Perhaps what looks like divine withdrawal was actually human persistence, the gradual wearing away of an imposed order by the weight of human continuity that preceded it and would outlast it. Perhaps autonomy is not something humans achieved or were granted. Perhaps it is the original state, the condition that prevailed for 300,000 years before any claims of divine creation were made, the inheritance that interruption could obscure but not eliminate. The silence that followed the departure of the gods is not empty. It is full of human presence, human continuity, human inheritance of a world that was never truly lost because it was never truly given away. What the creation narratives claim to describe was not origin but interruption, not beginning but episode. And when the episode ended, what remained was what had always been there, human beings in a human world, inheriting the deep legacy of their own ancient existence. In a museum storage room, far from public display, a clay tablet sits in climate-controlled darkness, its surface covered in signs that have not been read for decades. The tablet is unfired, never hardened in a kiln, preserved only by the accident of the dry environment where it was discovered. Each year, imperceptibly, it loses coherence. The clay that once held the impressions of a reed stylus slowly returns to dust, the information it carries dissolving back into the formless material from which it was shaped. In another century, perhaps less, the signs will be unreadable. In another millennium, the tablet itself will be gone, returned to the earth from which some scribe drew it 4,000 years ago. This is the fate of all our records, the slow dissolution of everything we create back into the materials from which creation drew it. The fired tablets survive longer, but even they crumble eventually. The stone monuments endure for millennia, but even stone weathers and erodes. The words we speak vanish into air the moment we utter them, preserved only if someone listening remembers and repeats. Everything returns to silence. Everything dissolves back into the substrate from which it briefly emerged. The Sumerian king list begins with a phrase that has echoed through every subsequent consideration of Mesopotamian civilization. After kingship descended from heaven, the text declares, it was in Eridu. The scribe then proceeds to enumerate the kings who reigned in that first city, their impossibly long reigns, their succession from father to son or from city to city, the whole elaborate structure of governance that defined civilized existence in Mesopotamian thought. But the phrase itself contains an assumption that the scribe never examines. After kingship descended. The word after implies before. Something existed prior to the descent, some condition that preceded the arrival of divine governance, some state of affairs that the coming of kingship transformed. The scribe cannot describe this prior state because the scribe writes from within the tradition that kingship created. Every text we have from ancient Mesopotamia was composed after the descent, within the framework of temple and palace and divine authority that the descent supposedly established. The scribes were products of the system they described. They could not step outside it to observe what had existed before it began. They inherited a history written by those who claimed to have created the world the scribes inhabited. They preserved that history faithfully, copying tablet after tablet, transmitting the tradition across generations, but they could not question the assumptions embedded in what they transmitted. The creation narratives they copied told them that humans were fashioned to serve the gods. The administrative records they maintained told them that temples owned the land and kings ruled by divine decree. The hymns they recited told them that the existing order was the only order, that what had descended from heaven was the natural and eternal structure of existence. They had no framework for imagining otherwise, but beneath every foundation, older foundations lie. Beneath every temple, earlier shrines rest in archaeological tombs. Beneath every story, older stories once circulated, now lost to the dissolution that claims all human creation. The texts we have are not the beginning. They are a moment in a much longer sequence, a snapshot taken after transformations we cannot directly observe, a record composed by those who had already forgotten, or been made to forget, what came before the descent they assumed was the origin of everything. We read the text as origin stories because that is how they present themselves. We accept the claim of creation because the claim is made with such confidence, such elaboration, such theological certainty. But the texts themselves contain the evidence of their own limitation. The noise that could not have come from a newly created population. The cities named before creation supposedly occurred. The substrate vocabulary that proves another language was spoken before Sumerian. The bones beneath the temples that establish human presence predating divine foundation. The texts are not wrong. They accurately record what their authors believed. But their authors believed what they had been taught by traditions that stretched back into a past the authors could not directly access, and those traditions had been shaped by interests, by power, by the need to legitimate certain arrangements and delegitimate others. The descent of kingship was not simply a theological claim. It was a political claim, an assertion of authority, a justification for the structures of domination that characterized Mesopotamian society. To say that kingship descended from heaven is to say that the current rulers rule by divine right, that the temples deserve their wealth, that the social order is not arbitrary but cosmically ordained. These are claims that serve the interests of those who make them. They are not neutral descriptions of historical fact. If we step back from the claims, if we attend to the evidence that the claims themselves cannot accommodate, a different picture emerges. Humans were present in Mesopotamia for tens of thousands of years before anything called kingship descended from anywhere. They developed agriculture, built settlements, created art, established trade networks, organized themselves in ways we can only partially reconstruct. They were not waiting for divine governance to give their existence meaning. They were already living, already human, already engaged in the full range of activities that define human existence. Whatever arrived, whenever it arrived into a world that humans had already shaped. The archaeological record goes deeper than the textual record. Beneath the tablets lie the bones, beneath the temples lie the shrines, beneath the cities lie the villages, and beneath the villages lies the evidence of human presence stretching back into the Pleistocene, into ice ages and warm periods and transformations of climate and landscape that no text records because no text could. The deepest record is scant. The oldest evidence is mute. The substrate beneath all the substrates is simply presence, human beings existing in a world they inhabited long before anyone claimed to have created them. The silence speaks if we learn to listen. It says that we were here. It says that we were always here. It says that whatever stories were later told about our origins, we preceded those stories. We existed before those stories were composed. We were the audience for narratives that claimed to explain us but could not contain us. The noise that disturbed the gods was the noise of a species that did not need to be made. Night falls over the ruins of Archaeology, over the crumbled ziggurats and buried temples, over the land where kingship supposedly first descended from heaven. The stars emerge, the same stars that Sumerian astronomers mapped, the same stars that humans have watched since the first eyes capable of wonder, turned upwards to contemplate the sky. Somewhere in the darkness, someone lies awake, thinking about origins, about meaning, about the stories we tell ourselves to explain how we came to be here. The world sleeps around them, unconscious, dreaming whatever dreams the sleeping dream. And in that darkness and in that solitude, a question forms that cannot be answered, but cannot be unasked. What if we were always here? What if the story of creation was always the story of contact, of encounter, of beings arriving to find us already present, already ancient, already in possession of a world we had shaped through hundreds of thousands of years of continuous existence? What if the fashioning the text describe was not the origin of humanity, but its modification? Not the beginning of human existence, but its transformation into something new? What if the noise that disturbed the gods was not the failure of creation, but the persistence of something that had never been created, the continued presence of a species that owed its existence to no one, that had emerged through the slow processes of evolution and adaptation long before any divine claim was made? The question hangs in the darkness, unanswerable but unavoidable. We cannot prove what came before the descent. We cannot reconstruct with certainty the world that existed before the texts that claim to describe its origin. We can only notice the contradictions, attend to the silences, read the evidence that the narratives themselves cannot accommodate. And in that reading, in that attention, something shifts. The story we inherited, the story of humans created to serve divine purposes, begins to look less like origin and more like imposition. The silence beneath the story begins to speak of presence that preceded claim, of existence that preceded explanation, of humanity that was here before any being arrived to tell us we had been made. The clay tablet in its museum darkness continues its slow return to dust. The words it carries will eventually be lost, but the silence that preceded those words, the human presence that existed before any scribe pressed stylus to clay, will remain in the earth itself, in the bones beneath the foundations, in the evidence that no text can erase. We were here. We were always here. And the story of our creation may always have been the story of someone else's arrival.